What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about the prevalence of casual aphobia, the harm it causes to the ace and aro communities, and what we can all do to combat it. If there's one thing I've noticed since coming out as asexual and demi-romantic, it's that casual aphobia is everywhere. Aphobia is systemic and cultural prejudice against those whose orientations fall along the asexual and/or aromantic spectrums, and it can take many forms, including dismissal, erasure, discrimination, and the physical and emotional harm of aces and aros. For this video, I want to focus on casual aphobia, which I find particularly insidious because it's just so sneaky. It seeps into most aspects of life in ways that aren't really obvious at first glance, and may even seem harmless on the surface. What that does is perpetuate the idea that a lack of sexual and/or romantic attraction is something abnormal, something that needs to be fixed. Or the idea that asexuality and aromanticism aren't real orientations. These are already commonly held beliefs in society, and casual aphobia maintains that status quo. So how can you recognize casual aphobia? What does it look like? One way to spot it is to keep an ear out for statements that imply that sex and romance are a quintessential aspect of being human, that everyone needs to experience sex and romance in order to have a complete and fulfilling life. A classic example that most aces and aros hear when we come out is, "You just haven't met the right person yet." This doesn't sound like bigotry on its face, and the intention behind it is usually not bad. It tends to come from a place of trying to give someone comfort or encouragement, like, hey, don't give up. But what makes this sentiment aphobic is the assumptions that are baked into it. That there is a right person for everyone, and that you won't be happy until you find yours. Or that finding yours will fix you and make you normal. There's no room in this phrase for people who are perfectly content without sexual and/or romantic partners. What makes this type of aphobia casual is that it's not overtly hateful, but it still carries a ton of implications about how aces and aros don't really exist, or shouldn't exist, or aren't fully human, or are broken in some way. And casual aphobia is so common that it's impossible to avoid. You can't go to school, go to work, go to social gatherings, or enjoy mainstream media without running into it at some point. It's an unfortunate reality that aspec folks have to brace ourselves for it when interacting with most allo folks or consuming most work that allo folks create. And that can get really, really exhausting. I'll give you a few examples. One time when I was recovering from a surgery that left me with a pretty prominent scar, I had someone give me random, out-of-the-blue advice that I did not ask for on how to prepare my future husband for what he would see when we did it. And holy crap, where do I even start with the incorrect assumptions, not to mention the overall inappropriateness of bringing that up in the first place. Another time, I was watching The Big Bang Theory, which does not hold up now, but 10 plus years ago it was good enough for me as a nerd who needed something both humorous and relatable to watch to help me get through tough times. And there was this one scene where Penny asks what Sheldon's deal is, meaning what kind of people he's into. The rest of the guys respond that Sheldon has no deal, and Penny says, "Come on, everybody has a deal." Which is another form of casual aphobia, the assumption that everyone is into someone and that not experiencing sexual or romantic attraction is simply unheard of. Honestly, Sheldon could have actually been some really good aspec representation if the writers on that show had had a clue, but unfortunately. Another time, I was watching Captain America: The Winter Soldier, and there's a scene where Natasha Romanoff kisses Steve Rogers to avoid being spotted by Hydra agents, then later asks him, "Was that your first kiss since 1945? And there are a couple of things that get said in the resulting exchange that give off some casually aphobic vibes. One is when Natasha tells Steve that everybody needs practice at kissing, which assumes that everyone even engages in kissing in the first place. There are many aces and aros who don't. The other is when Steve says, "That wasn't my first kiss since 1945, I'm 95, I'm not dead." which implies something even worse about people who don't engage in kissing for long periods of time or at all. I mean, I haven't kissed anyone in more than a decade and I am very much alive over here. A lot of people hearing these examples might think, oh, that's not that bad, or that's just a joke, lighten up. And they would be 100% correct if these were one-off things, because none of these examples were overtly aphobic on their own. But it's the cumulative effect of these kinds of comments from people you know, or jokes you hear in TV and films, and the way the aphobic attitudes behind them are so normalized that has a harmful impact on aspec people. Something else I've noticed is that casual aphobia can serve as a barometer for more targeted, intentional bigotry against aces and arrows. And to give an example of that, I want to talk about a panel I went to at an anime convention where some ace-spec friends and I got slapped in the face with blatant acephobia after hearing some casual acephobia that, in hindsight, was a big red flag. So this panel was about BDSM and kink and anime and manga, and at one point the presenter made the offhand comment that everybody has sex. And my first thought as an ace who doesn't have sex was, not everybody. Classic example of casual aphobia, frustrating to hear, but like I said, this kind of thing is so common that if I let myself get worked up over it every time I heard it, I would never enjoy life. So I just shrugged and thought, this guy probably forgot about aces or doesn't know we exist and didn't mean anything by it, whatever. But nope, I was wrong, because we get further into the panel and the presenter starts debunking common myths about BDSM, and one of the myths he's trying to debunk is that BDSM doesn't have to be sexual. And I'm sitting there very confused because even though BDSM can be sexual, and it is for a lot of people, it's not inherently sexual. That's why it can work so well as a go-between in ace-allo partnerships where there might otherwise be sexual compatibility issues. It could be both a sexual thing that satisfies an allo partner and a non-sexual thing that satisfies an ace partner who are in a relationship with each other. And if you want to learn more about the intersection between asexuality and BDSM, you can check out my Ace Misconceptions video here. But this panel host was not only trying to debunk the myth that BDSM doesn't have to be about sex, he even took it a step further and said, I know people have been claiming BDSM isn't inherently sexual because they're trying to acknowledge the asexual community, but actually BDSM is about sex, and trying to separate BDSM from sex diminishes what BDSM is all about. And at that point, I just had to get up and leave, because that crossed the line from casual acephobia into direct, blatant acephobia. Earlier, when he had said everybody has sex, that wasn't enough to prove that he had acephobic views, because that's the kind of thing that could easily be said out of ignorance rather than malice. But the moment he actually mentioned asexuals and then immediately dismissed us, that's when I knew that this was not someone I wanted to give a second more of my time or attention to. Especially not during my vacation weekend when I was supposed to be having fun. But there's no way that aspec folks can truly take a vacation from this kind of thing. Even if you don't run into that level of in-your-face aphobia, you're still bound to run into casual aphobia at some point, unless you spend your vacation entirely off the grid or something. When casual aphobia is that pervasive, what kind of harm does it cause to aces and arrows? I see some of the most harm happening in the following areas. Education. If you live in the US like I do, you'll probably know what I mean when I say that sex education is severely lacking in our schools. It varies from state to state, where some students might get better sex ed than others, but in some states you get abstinence-only sex ed, which is basically no sex ed at all. Regardless of the differences from state to state, some things that are missing from sex ed across the board are discussions about consent, about sexual orientations, and about what does and doesn't constitute sexual attraction, which obviously has detrimental effects on everyone, but especially queer people. And when you throw casual aphobia in there, it's detrimental to aces and arrows in a particular way. By not going in depth on consent, most sex ed ends up inadvertently positioning sex as an expectation, something you will do someday because everyone does. It doesn't matter how you feel about it, eventually you'll find your person and it will happen. And why would you even need to know how to say no in that situation? If there's not really room for discussion of consent in sex ed, and the widely accepted assumption in society is that you won't need to worry about saying no once you find the right person, just think about where that leaves A-spec folks who may never have that person. And similarly, if there's not really a place in sex ed for discussing queer orientations, just think about where that leaves A-spec folks whose orientations are generally believed not to be real. And if you have abstinence-only sex ed, that's the worst for aces, because they'll hear you say, "Don't have sex before marriage, it's a sin," and go, "Okay, easy enough." Only to be wholly unprepared for marriage should they ever end up in one, wondering why they just aren't enjoying this sex thing that their spouse has been counting down the days for ever since they started dating. When sex education is already lacking, casual aphobia just means it's going to be lacking even more. And that's going to keep perpetuating the cycle of ignorance around A-spec orientations, which of course leaves aces and arrows in the position of having to educate ourselves. Healthcare. A-spec orientations have a long history of being pathologized in the medical system. In the early 19th century, women who didn't want to have sex with their husbands were described as frigid, and early versions of the DSM included frigidity as a form of sexual dysfunction. But how many of these women who didn't want to have sex with their husbands actually had some form of sexual dysfunction, and how many of them were just ace, or maybe lesbians or some other form of queer, or simply coerced into a marriage they never wanted in the first place? In 1977, 2 different sex therapists independently came up with pathological labels for people who had little to no sexual desire. Helen Singer Kaplan called it hypoactive sexual desire, and Harold Leaf called it inhibited sexual desire. Then in 1978, both of these sex therapists came together to propose that inhibited sexual desire be added to the sexual disorders of the DSM-3, and it was in 1980 when the DSM-3 was published. Now, desire is a bit of an unclear term here. Does it mean lack of desire for partnered sex? For sex with a specific partner? For solo sex? For hearing any talk or seeing any media about sex? When we say desire, are we talking about attraction? Are we talking about libido? Are we talking about interest or curiosity? Who knows? But these questions are important because without them, you can see just how easily aces would get caught in the net of inhibited sexual desire diagnoses, especially back in the 1980s when we didn't even have the kind of framework for talking about asexuality that we have now in 2023. Over the years and various revisions to the DSM, the diagnosis of inhibited sexual desire evolved. First, it was split into 2 categories: hypoactive sexual desire disorder and sexual aversion disorder. Then later, hypoactive sexual desire disorder was given separate diagnostic criteria for men and women, unfortunately along very binary and cisgender-centric guidelines. That happened in 2013 with the publication of the DSM-5, which was also when asexuality was first mentioned in the diagnostic criteria for hypoactive sexual desire disorder, with a statement saying that if low desire is explained by self-identification as asexual, then a diagnosis is not made. That recognition of asexuality is extremely important, and it's a sign of progress. But unfortunately, it doesn't take into account the lack of comprehensive sex education I talked about earlier. How many people will even know enough about asexuality to self-identify as ace? And how willing are providers to mention asexuality to their patients as a possibility before diagnosing them with this disorder? It also doesn't take into account the decades and even centuries worth of casual aphobia that led to something like not wanting sex being pathologized as a disorder in the first place, instead of just seen as another sexual orientation. Queer spaces, when most people think that asexuality and aromanticism are something that needs to be fixed or even just not real, that makes it easy to dismiss them as legitimate orientations, which in turn makes it easy to exclude aces and arrows from queer spaces and queer community. Aspec exclusion is a huge problem within the wider queer community, and it's been a huge problem for quite some time. Actually, when I first started questioning my orientation after the end of my last romantic relationship in 2012, one of the first things I ran into online was the discourse about whether aces and arrows counted as queer, and that discourse is unfortunately still going strong now in 2023. I can't help but see a connection between the pervasiveness of casual aphobia and the pervasiveness of exclusion against aces and arrows. When it's become so normalized to dismiss aspec orientations in society in general, then of course it's going to become just as normalized to dismiss them in queer spaces as well. And that doesn't seem logical when you consider how the queer community exists, because those of us with genders and orientations that differ from the cishet norm have been excluded by mainstream society. So why would any queer person exclude another queer person from our community knowing how that feels? But when you consider that homophobia often looks like gay people are an abomination, or transphobia often looks like trans people are freaks, whereas aphobia often looks more like aces and arrows aren't real, there lies your answer. Even if mainstream society hates gay people or trans people, they don't deny that gay people and trans people exist. With aspec people, mainstream society doesn't even get around to hating us because they dismiss us out of hand as something that can't exist. And in queer spaces, that often gets spun by exclusionists as you don't experience discrimination the same way we do, so you don't belong here either. If casual aphobia is so widespread and deeply entrenched and normalized in society, and so hard to spot because it's casual, what can we do about it? How can we push back against it? Here are a few tips. Educate yourself about aphobia by listening to aspec voices. Education is the key to combating ignorance, but we're clearly not going to get good education about aspec orientations in schools with subpar sex ed. Especially not with governments now trying to ban schools from mentioning queer people or teaching queer history in the classroom or having queer resources in their libraries. And even within queer spaces, there might not be an inclusive enough environment to learn about aspec orientations there. So that means we've all got to do the work of educating ourselves. Fortunately, that's getting easier all the time with the internet, because that gives aces and arrows a way to share their experience with a wider audience, which in turn helps everyone learn more about aspec orientations. That's actually one of the main reasons why I have this channel, so I can add my voice to the growing pool of aspec resources. And there are plenty of other aspec YouTubers out there, along with podcasters, bloggers, authors, artists, researchers, activists, etc., all sharing their voices too. So learning from those aspec voices is a great place to start when it comes to fighting casual aphobia. Make a conscious effort to be more inclusive of aces and arrows. This might mean thinking more carefully about how you frame discussions around sex, dating, and relationships. Learning to recognize biases and assumptions you hold that are rooted in aphobia. And of course, education is a prerequisite to this because you have to be aware of aphobia and how it manifests in your own worldview before you can root it out. But once you are aware of it, it gets easier with time and practice to stop yourself from continuing to spread it. When you first start making that effort to be more ace and arrow inclusive, you will find yourself making mistakes and saying things that make you cringe with embarrassment. And that's okay, it means you're learning. Even if you're ace or arrow yourself, you'll still screw up sometimes because internalized aphobia is a thing. But what matters is that you're figuring out how to do better. And finally, point out casual aphobia when you see it happen. If it's safe and you have the spoons to do so, of course. Most people simply aren't aware that they're perpetuating aphobic ideas and assumptions when they say harmless things like everybody has sex or you'll find the right person someday. The only way they learn is when someone, usually an aspec person, points it out. So if you're wondering how you can be an ally to aspec people, this is a really simple way. Pointing out the casual aphobia you encounter so the entire burden of doing so doesn't fall onto us. The first of my 3 tips was about educating ourselves. This one is about taking it a step further and educating others. Until we have much better and more widespread education about aspec orientations, casual aphobia will always exist. So the best thing we can do right now is to educate others about the casual aphobia they may inadvertently be spreading, so that little by little we can stop aphobia in its tracks. And that's where I want to wrap things up and turn the conversation over to you. What kinds of casual aphobia have you encountered? Have you ever seen casual aphobia end up being a red flag for more direct aphobia later? What ideas do you have for tackling the spread of casual aphobia? What questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. If you want to reach out to me on other social media, I am GC Kenzie across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support. I hope you learned something new, and I will see you on the next one.